Hey guys, Jake Kelsey, lead artist of Duct Tape Games here with just a quick demonstration of how our environments are being built for the upcoming game Broadside. We've been working on the art style and meshes for the environment for over a year now, refining how the game looks and feels. Even so, this is still pre-alpha footage and everything you see here is still obviously subject to change. The islands themselves are made of individual meshes, made of a sculpted plane with a normal mapped texture on it. We then place ground cover and foliage over the top of it and save it as a prefab so we can drag the model out with all the detail already on it. We have two different sized base meshes at the moment, as you can see. The smaller island is in a bit more of an L shape, so we can get a few more interesting shapes to the final islands. The larger island is there to cover more space on screen. In game you should not be able to see the other side of the large island if you're sailing off the coast of it, just to give you an idea of the scale. We just drag out the islands and position them around in various spots like so. From this distance you can see the difference between the way the small island and cliff and the large island are covered in foliage. The larger island has another plane over it which has a tessellating texture on it, which is then broken up by individual grass meshes and ferns, whereas the cliff and the small island only have the smaller meshes on them. Closer up the LOD doesn't have as much of an effect and it doesn't look any different. Bringing a cliff face out gives us a bit more visual interest to the island, adding a bit of a darker colour as well as some nice sharp shadows to the surrounding environment. The cliff also allows us to add specific features to some important islands and locations, such as waterfalls, coves and inlets that stand out a little bit more. The meshes themselves can all be scaled to fit in a bit better and to make sure that the whole island doesn't look tessellated. One thing we were trying to do originally was to have all of the foliage be placed individually on each island, so that they would literally be covered in ferns, bushes, grass and timber. Unfortunately we ran into the problem that we usually do here at Duct Tape Games, and that was just having far too many things on screen at any one time. Our computers just couldn't keep track of that many objects at once, so we've had to adopt a more simplistic style for the foliage, having much larger meshes with much more of a detail focused on the textures and normal maps rather than the actual objects themselves. Positioning of these base meshes is fairly important, as you can't have too many sharp edges in between the islands or the seams become fairly apparent. There's a decent amount of detail in the sand of the islands to try and combat this. It's basically all highlighted by the normal maps, so they react to which direction the sunlight is actually coming from. By carving in the lines in the sand, it doesn't look as noticeable when you've got other lines and seams basically meeting them. The point of having multiple smaller meshes to make up the islands is so that we can get a good variety in the environments in the game. It's not just the same island copy-pasted. Each section of the world will be hand-built and unique. By combining this many objects into a single piece of terrain, you can really get some nice organic lines which you can then build on. I've made many islands now using these objects, and none of them have been the same. A new thing I'm playing around with at the moment is getting rocks and other objects placed on these islands. I'm not really sure how much of it is needed yet, nor what the best method to place them is, but I think it does add a bit more interest to the island itself. Basically the way I do it currently is to drag out many rocks and just place them in random spots all over the island once I've built the base island itself. This means that the rocks are not placed on the prefabs at the start, so you don't always get the same rocks in the same spots. This helps further build the islands up as a single cohesive set piece, rather than many separate objects. When we're building the islands, the whole point of the process is to try and make them as easy to build as possible, but still make them look handmade. This is our philosophy when it comes to texturing as well. Looking closely you can see the individual brushstrokes on our textures, and we're not trying to hide that. The whole point is to build a vibrant, colourful, but thoroughly handmade world. Photorealism is definitely not the objective. Once there are a few rocks over the island, it's time to randomize them. I start by grabbing a few at random scattered all over the island and just start messing with the scale and rotation figures. Then grabbing a few others and doing the same to them. By playing around with them and using the slide scale tool and not entering in the numbers, it helps to get them all to random sizes and rotations fairly organically. The rocks themselves are of course all the same mesh, but by having a decent normal map on them, not only do you get different colours, but they also react to light differently. This means that with the one mesh you can get an amazing variety of shapes and specular reflections. Once they've been rotated and scaled, it's time to place them on the island. I drag them down individually so that they make contact with the island mesh itself. This way I can actually place them deeper into the ground if I wish, basically obscuring more or less of the rock and adding even more of an organic look. One thing I hope to show you in a future update is an improvement to the water shader that David's been working on. The main difference is that instead of a hard edge between the islands and the water, it fades in nicely, giving a much more subtle but also a much more beautiful shoreline. We currently have a working version of this, but there's still a few kinks to work out, so that'll probably have its own video when it's done. One thing I find helps when creating each island is to give each one a unique and hand-built feature. To keep the time down, I'm just filling this cove in with rocks, but having a unique feature makes the island a lot less boring, basically. Whether it be an island completely surrounded by cliffs, or a smaller outcrop on one side with just a single palm tree on it, just something simple to help create the hand-built world aspect that we're going for. And there we have the base mesh for our tropical island. Now the one thing this island is obviously missing is trees. David's built an amazing tool for us to populate the islands with trees. As you can see by the rocks, it takes a long time to manually place hundreds of objects on the islands. However, having this tool allows us to paint meshes on any object with a collider on it, and it then orients the mesh based on the average normal of that collider. This means that if I put a tree on a hill, then that tree will be angled with the hill. I place larger regular trees on the interior of the island, and then surround them with a couple of different sorts of palm tree. The tree prefabs that the painter is using also have scripts attached to them, so they'll sway in the breeze. This adds some movement to our scene along with the animated water as well. This automatically applies animations to the trees, which then cast shadows onto the ground cover. The specular reflections from the ground cover and the foliage is then broken up by these shadows, meaning that we get some nice shininess to the foliage, but we don't just get big sections of white reflecting back, because remember, for the ground cover, we're just using planes. As you can see, after the past year of working on these meshes and tools, we've finally gotten to the point where I can create an interesting and unique island in less than 10 minutes. I guess now it's time to actually build the game world. Broadside is currently slated for release in September this year. Hopefully I'll be able to provide some more updates and trailers as that date gets closer and we have more pretty things to show off. Until then, have fun!